the first presentation will be on comparing reserves and resource standards. So this is going to be an overview of everything we've already talked about on COGI and Act 51-101, PRMS, and SEC, just highlighting some of the similarities and differences between them. And there will be a short section at the end looking at a couple other classifications like Russia and China. But I should put a disclaimer out there that the information I have on the Russian and Chinese systems is from 2005, so it might be slightly outdated. To start out with, we'll talk about COGI, PRMS, and SEC guidance. So the purpose of the guidance is one of the fundamental differences. COGI is about asset valuation. It's trying to derive a reasonable representation of asset value. It also includes a component for regulatory reporting. PRMS is specific to project evaluation. There's no standards outside of how to define, classify, and evaluate reserves and resource volumes. SEC is specifically tailored towards regulatory reporting. COGI is probably the most detailed set of guidelines out of the three. It's the most comprehensive guidance. PRMS provides less detail in general, but it is more flexible because there's not as much specific information and detail. SEC, again, just highlighting the fact that SEC is all about comparison. It's all about comparison between companies. COGI, the ultimate purpose of the evaluations under COGI are an approximation of NPV. Same with PRMS. SEC is not intended to provide an estimate of NPV. The constant price casing, the ability to only reflect proved reserves volumes, it really has nothing to do with value of comparing volumes. So one of the major differences in COGI between PRMS and SEC is what we call split conditions. So split conditions means different certainty categories. So when we're looking at proved, probable, and possible, they have different conditions for assigning volumes. So some examples of split conditions: development timing. So you could have a location 4 years out that meets all the other classifications of proved reserves. It meets all the classifications of probable, but you would only be able to assign it to the probable category because of the split condition on timing. Testing requirements: 1P. So for proved reserves, proved undeveloped reserves, you have to have a test in the production or formation. 2P, 3P, you can use analogs that have shown evidence of productive rates. So again, it's a difference of conditions or hurdles to assign 1P versus 2P or 3P reserves. Enhanced recovery projects, 3P analogs, as long as you can show that the project is feasibly to possible reserves, but you might not necessarily have 1P and 2P reserves. So in general, this is highlighting the fact that PRMS and SEC, if you have probable reserves, you're likely also going to have proved reserves because the conditions for reserves are the same. The timing conditions in PRMS and SEC are 5 years, whether it's proved or probable. COGI is really the only guidance that has split conditions between different certainty categories. Lease fuel is one of the other major differences between the three. PRMS states that you can include lease fuel, so this is shrinkage. This is again volumes that are being used between the time the raw gas is produced from the wellhead and the time it gets sold at the market. These are losses in the field, shrinkage due to facilities. PRMS says you may include it, lease fuel, but you have to include an offsetting operating cost. So you end up with additional reserves volumes but lower value. In COGI, it's explicitly excluded. You're not allowed to include lease fuel as reserves volumes, and in SEC, it's also excluded. So this goes back to the first presentation we were talking about, and it just shows some of the differences between the guidance and the regulations. So again, this is a good overview now that everyone is familiar with all the documents. You can see that Act 51-101, as we spoke, specifically includes COGI in its reference. It says you must conduct evaluations for public disclosure under COGI guidelines. The regulatory body that controls and monitors public disclosure in Canada is the Alberta Securities Commission and the Canadian Securities Administrators. In the U.S., there is no direct link to PRMS within the disclosure guidance. In the U.S., most companies use PRMS as their evaluation guidelines internally, but they're not required to by the disclosure guidelines to see definitions and classifications for reserves. And just to show a jurisdiction that does use the Chapter 5 regulatory information, does specifically reference PRMS. Australia, they use PRMS for all their evaluation. We've seen this one before. It's talking about the words and verbiage used for 1P, 2P, 3P. You can see that the SEC and PRMS, after that final rule change in 2009 by the SEC, they adopted the PRMS proof. So they're identical for 1P, 2P, and 3P. There's some slight differences between COGI definitions and PRMS, but they have identical intent. They're supposed to come up with the exact same reserves volumes based off the definition. Disclosure comparison. TSX, you're under COGI and NI 51101. Your prices that you're disclosing on your forecast pricing. Required volumes, 1P and 2P. Company gross and net. And the value, again, like we're talking about in the intent slide, is an approximation of NPV. New York, regulation S-K and S-X. Make up the guidance and disclosure. The price is constant based on the first trading day of the previous 12 months. They only require approved reserves to be disclosed. You're not allowed to disclose resources. And the intention is for comparative purposes. NI 51101 versus SEC. So they both require approved reserves. NI 51101 requires 2P reserves as well. SEC has 2P and 3P is optional. 3P is optional in Canada. Not a lot of companies disclose 3P reserves in Canada. What NI 51101 does say is if you disclose 3P reserves at any point in time, you must continue to disclose 3P reserves. So you can't disclose them for a single year and then stop disclosing. Volumes disclosed in NI, you have company gross as well as net. In SEC, you only have company net volumes. Price forecast, escalated versus constant. Prospective and contingent can be disclosed under specific guidelines in Canada. In the US, you are strictly prohibited from disclosing resource volumes in any public documentation. You can't even press release contingent resource volumes in the US. So if we look at the major differences between NI and SEC, as we've said many times, forecast prices versus constant prices, that's the single biggest difference between the two systems. Financing, in terms of whether you can book reserves, whether you believe the company can raise the capital required to develop the projects that you're booking reserves to. In NI 51101 and COGI, that's not a consideration for reserves. It's not up to the evaluator to decide how or if a company can finance the project. The SEC says there should be a reasonable expectation of project financing, so you can't have a situation that this would impact would be a very small oil and gas company with a very large asset base or a large amount of undeveloped lands that has many locations and very high capital requirements. It's unlikely that that company will be able to service those capital requirements within the reasonable time frame limits. Under NI 51101, you wouldn't, that wouldn't have an impact on your evaluation. You wouldn't need to worry about whether the company could actually raise that capital or not. Under SEC, you would have. Economics require a positive NPV at corporate discount rate. So I spoke a little bit about it on day one in COGI. You have to have what they define as a reasonable rate of return to classify volumes as economic. So that means it has to be greater than an undiscounted. The SEC says it has to be positive at undiscounted rates. So part of the reason there's a difference there is because the SEC is under those constant prices, and they're usually a much higher hurdle on the pricing side, so they're not as worried about a return for undeveloped reserve. Enhanced recovery, NI 51101 has some flexibility as to when you can book reserves in the approval process, whereas the SEC says you cannot book reserves until you have approval. But the SEC, on the flip side, is more restrictive on what you can call an analog Fuel gas is excluded. In the SEC, the previous slide said it was excluded, and generally speaking, it is excluded, but there are exceptions where companies have included them, and as long as they offset it with the appropriate costs as per PRMS, they have been allowed to disclose them. Report independence is required in NI 51-101, so that's the independent qualified reserves evaluators and auditors. It's optional under SEC. And disclose reserves, company gross versus company net. It's technically company gross and net for NI and company net for SEC. We've seen this plot before. It's showing the difference between forecast cost evaluation and constant price evaluations and the material difference it can have on the volumes. Again, if you look at 10 years out on this plot in 2026, there's a $30 to $40 difference in the price of oil. What that means is as we get further on time and wells are reaching their economic limits, which is when reserves under forecast pricing and costs, they're going to have a $30 to $40 uplift on oil compared to the constant price, so the wells will run a lot longer and you'll recover more reserves volumes under a forecast price scenario. So that's why it can have a material difference whether you're running on constant or forecast pricing. So going back to the conclusions that we had on the first slide, or in the first presentation on day one, COGI, NI 51-101, PRMS, and SEC are virtually identical in terms of definitions. There are minor differences, but materially they are the same. In Canada, there's a direct link between the guidance and the regulatory work. In the US, the SEC does not specifically reference PRMS. They have their own guidelines. The differences in the disclosure requirements can affect an evaluator's approach. That goes back to what we talked about, where starting with proved reserves in the US can come up with a very different result than starting with best estimate or 2P reserves does in Canada. It's two different approaches to evaluations, and because of that, you can end up with very different results in some circumstances. But it's important to understand the differences between the systems. So this section, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about other standards throughout the world. The scroll generally doesn't use these classifications, so I'm not nearly as familiar with any of the other classification systems used in many other countries throughout the world as I am with COGI, PRMS, and SEC. But there's some pretty good documentation out there that gives you a high-level overview of comparisons between all the various standards. So there's a mapping report that the SPE put together in 2005 that really compares 8 of the recognized standards across the globe. So it was looking at US, British, Canadian, Russian, Chinese, Norwegian, USGS, and United Nations frameworks and comparing them from a very high level to see how similar the various classifications were. You can see sort of a summary of the intentions and the scope of the various documents. So you can see that the Canadian guidance, which is COGI, has the widest breadth of any of the classification systems out there. That's when we're talking about how comprehensive COGI is. This is really what that's highlighting. So it covers everything from the definitions to the guidelines to some brief guidance on disclosure. And the application examples, the dotted lines, back in 2005 when they were doing this comparison, the CSA and SPWE chapter in Calgary was pulling together a whole bunch of very specific examples for different types of classifications, so it was in progress. You can see the government reporting organizations, so they have a different intention that's probably much more similar to what Mongolia is going to be implementing, so Norway, Russia, and China. The entire intent of their classification systems is for government reporting. You can see the two they have listed as internationally accepted standards are the UN and SPE, which is PRMS. So there's a lot going on in this chart. This one is talking about all the various classifications of volumes. The leftmost column is SPE PRMS, which is what everything in this mapping report was being compared to. So you can see that the SPE and the CSA, which is Canadian. So SPE in the first column, CSA in the fourth column, they're virtually identical. That's what we've been talking about. This is a different representation of the McKelvey box, the box we looked at in the first day with all the various resource categories. You can see out of all the standards here, the Norwegians, the Russians, and the Chinese are the ones that differ the most in terms of the terminology. But what is common here is pretty much every classification of volume that you see in the SPE is very similar across most. There's an equivalent volume or a semi-equivalent volume in almost all the classification systems. So specifically looking at the Russia guidance that they brought in 2005 and comparing it to SPE, they have very similar definitions for reserves. They call contingent resources, they actually call them reserves. So everything that's discovered is called a reserve under the Russian guidance. They have classifications, so A, B, and C1 are essentially equivalent to proved developed, producing, proved developed, non-producing, and proved undeveloped. The C2 classification is kind of a what they call inferred volumes, is kind of a combination of probable and possible. And C3 is sort of it's a mix between possible reserves and what would be classified as contingent resources. Alright, sorry, the right side, they've got C2 listed twice. So it's C2 that can overlap between possible reserves and contingent resources. They also have 3 different categories for what they call recoverable resources. So this is prospective resources in COGI PRMS. And the 3 categories that they have in there, the D1, D2, D3, are essentially equivalent to the maturity subclasses that you see in COGI and PRMS. So that's the lead, the prospect, and the play in the PRMS system. So again, they have different terminologies. They have different words for them. They do call their reserves stretch into 2 categories. Anything that's discovered is classified as reserve by verbiage, but they have the same basic definitions as resources if they have contingencies. So the Chinese system is probably the least directly comparable to PRMS standards or COGI standards. There's still a rough correlation between they're still the same buckets. They're just defined with very different terminology. So basically, the McKelvey box that had volumes moving left to right is now top to bottom here. You still got petroleum initially in place. You still got discovered and undiscovered volumes. After you get past discovered, you start getting into what they call measured, indicated, and inferred reserves. So again, they're like the Russians, where as soon as a volume is discovered, regardless of whether it's commercial or not, they call it reserves. So that's one of the major differences between these 2 systems and PRMS. They have a whole bunch of different categories, and the reason at the end they start splitting out production and remaining is because the Chinese system is based on total volumes. They don't talk about remaining recoverable volumes very often, so all of the equivalents in the Chinese system. So if you looked at proved developed, proved undeveloped in the Chinese system, in order to make a direct comparison to PRMS, you would have to subtract the cumulative production because the Chinese only talk about the estimated ultimate recoverable volumes. They don't talk about the remaining recoverable reserves. The certainty guidelines for proved in China are a little bit less stringent than COGI and PRMS. If you're using probabilistic methods, they talk about a P80 instead of a P90. If you're using deterministic methods, they say you should estimate reserves within plus or minus 20% for proved and within plus or minus 50% for probable. So, and the deterministic for probable and possible are P50 and P10, so they're the same. It's only the P80 versus the P90 on proved. But the deterministic definitions make it sound like the Chinese definitions for 1P and 2P are a lower level of certainty than the PRMS definitions. In terms of talking about unconventional volumes, the Chinese do mention CBM, but they say they use the same classification system as they do for their conventional resources. There's nothing currently in place for oil sands and bitumen in the Chinese system. Pricing is based on current market conditions, so again, very similar to Russia and PRMS. The Chinese are also in the same, similar to the Russians, where there's not a strong distinction between possible reserves and contingent resources. They're likely what they call possible, the equivalent of their possible reserves for geological reserves is a combination of what PRMS would classify as 3P reserves and contingent resources. And again, that comes down to the commerciality requirements, and they don't have the commerciality distinctions between the reserves and